So yeah, thanks everybody for joining. My name is Brian Flora. I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at Beyond 20. I've been with Beyond 20 since 2006. So I've been doing this for a minute. I see quite a few names that I recognize, some Beyond 20 clients there and friends. So appreciate seeing you there. But for everybody else, if you guys just let us know in the chat, where are you in the world and what are you hoping to get out of the webinar here today? And in the meantime, I will hand it over to my colleague, Mark Hillyard, and let him introduce himself as well.
Hi, good afternoon, I suppose, from the East Coast, still morning everywhere else in the States. Yeah, so I'm a senior advisor at Beyond 20. I've been with the company coming up on the big 10, that's not 2, 10 years. I've done a lot, I've worn a lot of hats, but data governance is one of those areas that that's kind of very near and dear to my heart, especially when talking about migrating between platforms and how to manage the data, understanding and building a strategy around how to do that appropriately. I've been in the industry for more years than I care to count at this point, but I've been working in IT for quite some time across many industries. Started out primarily in web hosting and open source, and did a lot of data there. Worked on some of the largest DNS systems on the planet. So data is, again, sort of part of my DNA. Today we're going to talk a little bit about strategies for migrating data from legacy platforms to modern platforms a little bit, and understanding sort of some of the pitfalls and some of the considerations that you need to make when you're planning that out. But I'm going to pitch it back to my colleague here to tell you a little bit about what Beyond 20 is and what we do, if you're not familiar with us.
Sure, absolutely. And yeah, Mark and I, fun fact, have worked together for, gosh, it's got to be close to 20 years now, isn't it? This is this is our third company working together, and still pleased to do it. So for those of you who don't know us, Beyond 20 is a professional services and training firm. We assist with technology adaptation and digital transformation acceleration. So we have several partnerships that obviously you can see here in the NASCAR slide, if you will. But ultimately, there are kind of three pillars of the practice. We do certainly a lot of education. We do a lot of ITIL training, cybersecurity training, Agile and Scrum training. We have the advisory practice where we help organizations take those things out of the book and put them into real world practice. And then lastly, of course, we have the technology implementation side where we help to sort of institutionalize those best practices in platforms like Microsoft platforms and ServiceNow and Cherwell, of course. So moving right on to the topic at hand, we are looking at how we get our data migrated when we have one of those platforms. How do we get migrated from one platform to another? Specifically, how do we go from a legacy platform that we might have been in, whether it's Cherwell or Remedy or something else, into our brand new shiny ServiceNow implementation? How do we make sure that we get the right outcomes that we need to support from that? So as we go through this webinar today, we're going to kind of break this into 4 kind of broad areas. First thing is, how do we make a decision as to what data we should be migrating? Obviously, it's probably not everything. What kind of data retention policies and governance might feed into that? Specifically, once we've migrated data, how we need to make that accessible and what kinds of considerations to talk about there. And then ultimately, of course, security wraps around everything. So how do we do our data migration and automation of these things in a way that is supportive of the organization's need to keep this data secure and protected? So we can go ahead and jump right in on that. So the first question then is, what data should be migrated? I think, Mark, you've probably been through enough of these projects that you've seen the same things that I have, and I'll kind of throw it to you. But in my experience, folks either start out with one of two extremes on this kind of project, where either on one end they say, you know what, we're starting fresh, we're not going to bring anything across, we don't need it. That's all in the past, right? And then of course the other extreme is, no, we've got to have everything. We can't leave anything behind. We have to do a full lift and shift of the existing system, and we need all of that stuff in our new ServiceNow instance. What is your experience been with those?
Well, I think that there's that is generally the case, right? There is definitely a desire from many companies, and I don't know that it necessarily crosses certain industries or certain siloed sizes of companies, but I think those two extremes are very broadly represented in every migration project. You have somebody or somebodies who are like, either like, yeah, let's just burn it all to the ground and start over. Or we can't possibly lose one bit of our data. It's absolutely all essential. Chances are the better answer is somewhere in between those two things. And I think
sure, it's the starting point, right? So,
right.
I mean, chances are if you're replacing your platform, then, there's a reason you're replacing it. Right. So a lot of the times when you're going to something new, it's, not always, but a lot of the times there are not necessarily great feelings for the legacy platform that we're getting rid of.
Almost never, actually. very seldom have I walked into a migration or a transformation like that and had people go, we're really going to miss this old platform quite a lot. We really love it, and we're only leaving because something new and shiny came along. It's always, well, not always, but it's mostly you see people are leaving a platform because it just doesn't fit their needs anymore.
Right, and maybe hasn't for some time, right?
And right, and that's where the the diciness of understanding what data to be migrated comes into play, because chances are in those situations, especially if you've been, just sort of dealing with the platform for a while, trying to find a way out, which is it's pretty common, your data governance is starting to wane. Interest and motivation to keep the data clean and keep it consistent has waned greatly. And that's, I think, one of the first big questions you have to ask yourself when you're looking at the data and going, okay, we need to move this stuff, is how clean is it? I mean, when you're going to bring it into the new system, is there any value to it anymore when it lands?
So what? Actually, let's go back a step here. We keep throwing this term data around. What are we talking about? What kinds of things are we looking at when we talk about a data migration in this context?
Oh, that's fair. I think the records, the data that we're talking about here, for most folks, I think when they're moving is going to be very service management oriented. Now, that term has expanded vastly since I got into this, business. But, at its core, we have, IT service management data, incidents, requests, changes, and then subsets of those record sets, things like, approvals, tasks, certain specific, audit logs, things like that,
right.
That need to be considered as well. And I think that is definitely one of the core things we need to understand, especially as we're asking the question, is the data clean? Is, do we understand how the data is structured?
Right. But so to be clear here, we're talking, like, a lot of times when people think about a service management platform, they're talking about their help desk tickets, right? The incidents and the service requests and so forth. And yes, absolutely, that falls within the scope of this. But, I think it's broader than that as well. We end up thinking about things like, change records, knowledge articles. We have maybe over the course of, if we've been on a platform for 3, 5, 7 years, then we may have built up a fair amount of knowledge articles, known errors, problem records. Change records are changes are kind of ultimately, maybe their own animal entirely, but, really looking at all those kinds of things. And we could also be talking about project data. We could be talking about, lessons learned that are captured. If our service management platform is also our project management or program management platform, then we might have that. You might have, you might have time records, or, if you're using this as, it might have been a timekeeping system, there might be ties into accounting. So, the term data in this particular case can be fairly broad. I just wanted to clarify that, because again, a lot of times there's sort of this assumption that we're talking about help desk tickets, and yeah, we probably are talking about those things, but there's certainly much more to be considered than just that. Even the CMDB, right? Are we going to rebuild it from scratch in the new platform, or are we going to just try to bring that across?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I think the fact that, again, sort of the term service management and the data associated with service management has come to mean much more than just IT service desk, right? It does include, in a lot of systems today, HR, right? We're actually doing a lot of HR functionality, because there is such a tie-in to sort of traditional technology service management within our HR systems, which, that sort of leads us into the questions around, when we talk about the value of that data, also the risks associated with the data,
Sure.
because there's inherent issues with moving stuff like that. How, and we'll talk a little bit later about securely managing those data migrations when you do have data like that.
Yeah, so I think when you get into those things, there is the real, I think it merits mentioning and acknowledging that for the most part, your software vendors, your ServiceNow, your BMC, et cetera, most of the time they're going to tell you not to bring that data across, right? That you really, I remember, talking to some folks when it came to Remedy, for example, that, I've heard a lot of BMC folks say, yeah, we don't even recommend migrating data when you go from one version of Remedy to another version of Remedy, right? That bringing that data across can be thorny. So, we do have to acknowledge that, but at the same time, there are sometimes reasons that you need to bring it, and so we have to do that. But I think there is a strong. Would you say it's fair to say that there's a strong preference in general toward less is more on this kind of thing?
100%. ServiceNow is actually not that different when it comes to talking about data migration. They will tell you the same thing. In fact, as we sort of get into how that data is translated into the new system and how it becomes accessible, there's even limitations on building, sort of custom archival tables in ServiceNow, right? Yeah. They literally limit the number of things you can build, and understanding that, that can help drive this level of strategy. So yeah, I would say that this is true of almost every vendor now, that, the idea of sort of re-implementation includes greenfielding the data. The problem, that works.
So great. Why would you greenfield the data? Like, talk to me about that.
Well, if you want to just start from scratch, you have to consider the ramifications of, again, not bringing anything with you, like doing a full re-implementation, even if it's the same platform. But certainly when we're talking about disparate platforms, different vendors, you're basically stating that everything that came before, we're either going to put it out in some sort of data lake, right, which is probably the most common way of dealing with archiving these days when you're moving between platforms of any kind, or just, if you're a small enough, or a company that, to which, where that data retention is not as critical to you, you may just be, drawing a line in the sand and saying, okay, from, release date forward, that's all we care about. That's all we're going to keep. And
so why would I want to do that? Like, what's the advantage of the greenfield?
Well, the advantage of the greenfield is you have no legacy, what I would call bad habit data governance to deal with anymore. The challenge of bringing data anywhere is, how do we do it cleanly without causing, without the technical debt we're trying to get out from under.
Right, we're trying not to screw up our metrics, right? Like, ultimately we want to be able to look at our dashboards and reports and have clean data and understand that it's meaningful for us and make decisions based on it, right? But but ultimately, undoubtedly, as we move things across, the big elephant in the room is that you're probably not going to have exactly the same fields, right? So the idea of just like being able to import your data cleanly from Cherwell and just say, no, we're going to have this seamless thing, for example, from Cherwell into ServiceNow, we're going to go into this, seamless world where, all of these fields are just going to map one-to-one is a little bit of a pipe dream, right?
Almost entirely it is.
Yeah.
And that because the data structure will be inherently different. Yes, we can say that, if we were talking strictly around, service desk tickets, right? Let's just take incidents as an example. Yes, the basic framework is the same, right? Incidents have, statuses and owners and notes and things that go along with them, data fields that are going to be
priority
similar.
and et cetera. Yeah.
But they're not the same. That's the thing.
Right.
And with data, with any platform, any data platform, similar but not the same means very different, right? It's not
your service catalog might be different. You might have gone with a slightly different categorization scheme.
Right.
You might do, Cherwell uses that concept of specifics. So, the things that you built at the time when you built your specifics forms, 6 years ago, and may not be the questions that you need to ask and the information you need to gather when they open this type of ticket today, right?
Right, and that even goes a step further in that, with Cherwell, a specifics form, that's a whole separate data table from incident or request or wherever you're using those. When you get to, you come to ServiceNow and you look at an incident, that is all of the data that really is associated with that incident is likely in that same data table. It's, there are certainly other
so there's
tables,
a translation. So there's an element of translation there for sure.
Right? Absolutely. Yeah. And the more you try to do that, it gets thornier and thornier. And again, you start losing some of the governance and integrity of your data that you want to maintain going forward, right? Because you're moving platforms again to eliminate technical debt, right? 99% I would say of folks that are moving from one platform to another, going from a Cherwell or a Remedy to a ServiceNow, they're trying to get rid of a lot of the technical debt that's built up over the years that they had it. That's pretty common. And if you're just going to bring over the same stuff, and it's going to be difficult. And I think that's the big advantage to greenfielding, right? Is you're jettisoning that technical debt and putting it in the rear view.
But let's talk about incidents and service requests then for a minute then. So part of the reason you might do it is that maybe, and this gets into the kind of thrust of the question that we were trying to pose here on the slide. What of that data do we need to keep? And so what we find a lot of the time is that maybe it's not everything, and maybe it's not all data. Maybe we only need to bring across open tickets at the time, or maybe it's only tickets for the last 365 days, because we want to maintain that association with the requester, right? So that when Lindsay calls up the service desk and the service desk is using a ServiceNow platform now, that they still have access to her incident history, right? Say, oh, well, yeah, Lindsay's been calling every Tuesday for the last 6 months. And, maybe there's something that's an underlying problem here that we need to address. So, maybe she's just lonely. I don't know. Just Tuesdays are a dark day. So.
It can be. It's true.
Yeah, but really, like saying, okay, well, we maybe need to have the title and description of that incident and who owned it, so we know that it actually happened. But do we need all the journal notes and the entire history of something that happened 6 months ago? Is there an actual business value to that for us?
Right, and I think that to me, generally, you kind of hit the nail on the head with the question you need to ask yourself is, what is the value of this knowledge or data going forward for us? Does it provide us with, knowing that, Lindsay has had the same issue 35 times in the last 36 weeks, having that information going forward is good knowledge. But yeah, is all of the details of every, every phone call and every, email message that went back and forth important? It
Right.
probably doesn't carry the same level of value. And
Yeah, so let's actually go to our next slide then, because that I think segues into the notion of, one of the things that might really drive that is that, we have to look at what we have in terms of data retention policy, or what contractual obligations do we potentially have to retain that information.
Hey,
Right?
can I break in here for a second? To defend my honor, first of all, you're making me
Sure.
sound much needier than I am. But I've got a great question here that applies to what y'all were just talking about. So I'm going to read it verbatim. If we only want to bring over open incidents, like your example, is it easier to do a formal migration or to jam it into the new system?
Yeah. I'll take a swing at this first. I think it still doesn't. I think jamming it into the new system is probably not the right answer. I mean, as evidenced by the phrase jamming it in. But, again, you run into the issue that probably you're not going to end up with the same fields, like a direct mapping from one to the other. So, what we can do. So, for example, we have Beyond 20, we have a script, a program that migrates data from the Cherwell system into ServiceNow, and including attachments and ownership and all of that kind of stuff. But what we find is generally folks want to migrate that into an archive table, right? They want to be able to see, to have it accessible, but it's not mixed into the same tables with your regular, with the new incident data. If that answers the question. If it doesn't, please let me know what you need in terms of a follow-up.
I'll glom on to the end of that. I think with the question of migrating open tickets, right, things that are being actively worked today, is a unique question, because there are, part of the strategy that we would generally employ and recommend is, don't do it. I honestly just flat out don't move open, in progress, or in flight records across. Now, if you have to, and I've certainly worked with multiple clients that needed to do that, based on volume, based on sort of velocity of work, where
Customer
they did
expectations,
need to do that.
yeah, sure,
right?
Yeah.
Rather than forcing them to, we gotta close everything out. What I've seen, and neither of these, I'll be honest, neither of these solutions is particularly efficient. I think it comes down to sort of your appetite for the level of effort required. Either they do full on develop some sort of translation script, which that's one of the things that our script really deals with, is the data transformation from the legacy system to the new one, or they're doing it manually, which is to say that they're closing out whatever was in the old system, reopening and rebuilding the ticket entirely in the new system.
Yeah,
now,
I was
again,
going to say,
the volume question there,
yeah,
that needs to be answered for you. If you have 500,000 tickets that are currently open and in flight, doing that manually might not be a particularly effective way of doing it. But if it's a small number, and if you can sort of whittle it down as as development of the new system goes, because pretty much every organization that does this, you have that shadow operations period, right, where both systems are actually kind of live before you fully sunset the legacy system. If you can whittle down those open tickets during that go live period, the manual process is probably the simpler way to do it for most organizations.
Yeah, I was going to say, there is that element, the intern automation, right? You can, get somebody to manually go and create those tickets. Now, I mean, it does kind of depend on, you kind of have to look at the metrics for your organization. If the vast majority of your tickets are closed the same day they're opened, then yeah, we can probably left seat, right seat, or swivel chair, or whatever you want to talk about there for a day, and make that work. But we want to minimize that as much as we can. But then, the question on the data retention is, do we need to bring those attachments across? Like on the Cherwell side, that is the biggest piece of, that's the kind of biggest value add that we've got in that platform that we've created is that, attachments in the Sharewell platform are not stored in the way that you would expect them to be, and they don't reside in the place that you expect to find them. And so, and then, when you bring them over to your new ServiceNow records, they're going to have to exist in an entirely different, way, right? Then they're actually XML data in the database as opposed to attachments in Sharewell, and we're handling it a little differently in ServiceNow. So, but again, you kind of have to go and look at that data retention policy, see what specifically you're required to keep above and beyond what you might need, on a day-to-day basis, right?
Yeah, I think it's a great baseline for organizations that have that do have a specific retention policy to be able to say, okay, well, we know that we're not going to keep anything that's older than 6 months, right? That helps to eliminate, especially if you've got a very long relationship with that platform, you can eliminate, 70, 80% of the data right out of the gate, right? And say, okay, from a compliance standpoint, we don't need anything older than 6 months. And realistically, certainly when you're talking about, IT service management records, there's also certainly a useful lifespan for that information, right? Because things change fast enough that, a ticket from 3 years ago likely isn't the kind of knowledge that is nearly as relevant today.
Right. But again, that gets us into that notion of, there's kind of two questions. What do we need to actually do our jobs day in and day out? And what are we just required to keep? Right. And so that kind of gets to this. So that, we kind of get into the efficiency side of this. We titled this webinar, how to migrate data to ServiceNow, efficiently and securely. And the efficiency, I think, comes from looking at how we're going to do this, in an automated fashion, or how we're going to pare down and get to exactly the data that we need and nothing more. So that kind of brings us on to our next section, I think, which is, this notion of how we need to access the data, right? Because this can't be an afterthought. This is one of those things that will ultimately drive everything else we're doing here. If we, especially when it comes to the previous notion of, the data governance and retention requirements, if our retention requires that we have access to these things solely in the event that we get a FOIA request, or that, legal tells us that we need to be able to bring it back, but we have to, the governance requirement is that we have to be able to bring it back within 30 days. And that is an entirely different challenge than different task or different approach than if we have to have it, at the fingertips of every agent.
Absolutely. I think that speaks to, efficiently planning out the migration strategy, because if all I really need to do is dump the data somewhere where we can get to it, if it's a FOIA request, if that's, or there's a regulatory compliance requirement or contractual compliance requirement that if, client comes back or customer comes back and says, I need this data, we have we can simply go and retrieve it for them, then you're going to be able to very efficiently move the bulk of the data in those scenarios into a data lake of some kind, whatever, some sort of destination repository that is not even necessarily associated with the platform, right? That limits your need to come up with all of these translation and, and migration bits that are necessary if you're going to put it in the platform itself.
So changes are a good example of that, right? Like we've had a couple of projects recently where we have clients that need to keep change records for audit purposes, and they need to be able to see that these changes were evaluated and crucially, who signed off that there's actually an approval. Beyond 20, we're ISO 20000 certified, so we have to provide those kinds of records and retain those things internally to maintain our ISO credentials as well for our infrastructure. So get that, but at the same time, you don't necessarily have to have, all the details of the implementation plan or the test plan, retained for 10 years, right? There's
correct
a limit to these things.
Absolutely. And And so it is important to kind of separate, right? Some knowledge, though, some of that data may also have value beyond, the sort of historic record as well. And I think that's sort of the question you need to ask yourself as you're looking at these. There's, the initial question of, are we moving this data simply because we've always done it this way? The most dangerous phrase in all of technology. Or are you moving the data because it's going to be useful to you going forward? And while compliance and contractual requirements and regulations come into play as to what you must move over, and it also probably speaks to how it is accessed later, the knowledge that you need just on day-to-day operational stuff, that a user, I'm not gonna invoke Lindsay again, that a user has called multiple times over the past 6 months that they've had an issue. That data needs to be available to us when that user calls again, right? That user comes back to us with the same issue again. We need to know that that's been happening, and that's something that we need the system to be able to tell us. I'm not going to ask my service desk technician to go, okay, well, this user called today. Let me go out to our data lake, pull all of the records that have to do with this user, and see if there's any correlation, right? That kind of information, that kind of knowledge, I think is worthwhile to consider being useful to you going forward, at least for some period of time. Now, that brings the question of, do you want to merge the data into the new processes? Because your new platform will inherently have different procedures and processes associated with workflows, or is it something sort of sitting adjacent? Still archival, but available much more readily and much more in real time. And we do need to, when we're coming up with this strategy, we need to understand what that data looks like, because there's a merging data, and I'm going to jump into that right now because it's important. The difference between merging and archiving, right? Merging the data means that it becomes available to the new processes, the new workflows, all of the new relationships in the new platform. That is, without question, the most complicated migration you can do, because you have to translate whatever that data was and make it look exactly like the data that you're using now in the same structure. Understanding architecture from, relationship architecture at that point becomes really crucial, because if you look at the way that ServiceNow deals with relationships, you have to get the lowest relationship right. So if your lowest relationship down, if you're just doing a parent-child relationship, the lowest relationship is the one you got to get right out of the gate. And when you're talking about, say, users and relating things to users, knowing the user's location is actually one of the lowest relationships in ServiceNow. So understanding that level of architecture, if you're going to do merging, is absolutely critical, or you're going to you're going to end up with much more data mess than, than data governance.
So yeah, I mean, that's a reasonable concern. And as we talk about these things, again, we're talking a lot about, help desk tickets, but a lot of times, and for a lot of clients, those tickets can contain PII, right? They can contain, sensitive information. Depending on what systems they're working on, people might, as much as we may have a policy where we don't want people to put HIPAA data into a service desk ticket, sometimes people do. If you work on those kinds of systems, or in the federal world, you hope that we don't end up with potentially classified information there. Obviously, that's something we'd have to deal with separately. So I'll put that aside. But sure. But yeah, I mean, I think when you look at migrating these things, there is the assumption that you have to make that that there is PII there, right, and that we have to treat it accordingly. Absolutely.
Classified is certainly a beast unto itself. It's there's a whole there's a lot around that. If we're talking about actual DoD classification or governmental classification, sure. But even in the commercial world, we classify data, right? We classify our data today. And you talk about PII, but if you're in say you're in healthcare, and maybe your platform actually contains HIPAA compliant data that needs to be considered. that sort of level of security and privacy needs around your data absolutely is a huge consideration. And
I mean,
there's
especially when you deal with self-service, right? We can have policies around those things, but you don't necessarily know. I mean, we work with you know, a lot of universities, and in a self-service portal, students will put their social security number into things. They will put things about, you know, they'll put financial aid information in. They'll put things that you know, from student health. They'll put, you know, actual patient information into self-service forms. So yeah, I mean, obviously we need procedures to deal with those things. That's a topic for a separate webinar. But when we're migrating these things, I think we have to make the assumption that we are moving things that are sensitive and precious, right?
Absolutely. And that, you know, that brings up the idea of, you know, how are we moving the data? If you're going from an on-premise solution to a cloud solution, I mean, ServiceNow is pretty much exclusively cloud, which means you're moving it, it's going to the internet. And if you're moving from a tightly controlled on-premise system, if that's, you know, if that's what you have, or you're moving from another cloud to that cloud, you are likely going to have some level of data staging that you need to do, because you're likely not doing a direct one-to-one migration from database to database. There's probably some level of staging between the two, and you need to consider, okay, maybe it's encrypted, maybe that data is safe and encrypted and secure from in my legacy platform, and it's going to be secure and encrypted in my new platform. But what about that middle? What about that middle space? And what about the links between those things? And recognizing the need for encryption in transit, but also even encryption at rest when it's in that staging table. Those are things also that I think need to be considered, because again, the chances that you're doing a direct data migration from platform to platform is just about zero. Because today, most of our platforms, and ServiceNow is the rule, not the exception, are pretty much cloud-based. Which means you likely don't have direct database access the way we used to, in olden times when I could control all of my databases directly. Then I could do very easily manipulate data across platforms directly, but that's just not possible anymore. It's all going to be done through some level of API, which means you have to make sure that all of those connections are secure from end to end, and any staging data tables or lakes that you're going to use also need to be secure and encrypted in some fashion.
I guess that raises the point that, if you're migrating from certain types of legacy platforms where you have an on-premise database and maybe you had perpetual licenses, you may actually get to keep the data, right? If you have, maybe you can still have access to that SQL database or something like that going forward, in which case, we might just want to lock that down, and as long as we only need it for a FOIA request or something like that, maybe, we just keep it running, and we don't actually need to move it anywhere. But that's less and less common these days.
Yeah, certainly the ultimate automation, right? Don't do anything. Just leave it there and connect to it. But that also, but the need to do that, and sort of the complexity of data migration now from cloud to cloud, or on-premise to cloud, or cloud to on-premise to cloud. I don't know, I covered all of them, but recognizing the complexities of that, automation is inevitably going to be a primary goal, I think, in any migration strategy, because again, manually doing all of that and hoping to get it right for, possibly gigabytes of data, if not more, for some organizations. Larger enterprise organizations are likely moving huge amounts of data between these platforms. Coming up with an automation strategy, coming up with tools to manage those migrations, I think become part of the execution, part of the strategy up front. When we started seeing more and more migrations, to the ServiceNow platform, it was one of our biggest goals early on, was to say, okay, well, how do we get things you mentioned earlier, like attachments out of Sherwell and into something else? that has always been, it's always been a sticking point with the Sherwell Service Management platform. It was efficient the way that there's the way that Sherwell stores attachments, because they're storing them as, as basically data blocks rather than, file attachments, the way we think of attachments in a traditional sense.
Right.
But it made it very difficult without having a lot more sort of under the hood knowledge and information. It made it very difficult to extract those attachments and maintain data relationships with their parents.
Yeah, it got me thinking about the volume of data becomes, a really significant concern. I remember, Mark and I worked for an organization that ran a very, very large email infrastructure for, previous to being at Beyond 20. And I can remember back in, must have been maybe 2003, when we reached the threshold that we had a petabyte of email data, right? At the time, we were one of only, 3 enterprise storage clients in the world that had a petabyte of email data. It was like us and Yahoo Mail and Hotmail, I think, were the only ones that had, that volume of data. But there are a lot of organizations now that have a petabyte of data, or many petabytes, right?
That's absolutely true. Yeah, and in the ensuing 10 years, that actually expanded to, I think, I believe it expanded to an exabyte. Sometime in the early 2010s. So yeah, it's not data. Yeah, data volume becomes a massive thing. I know I'm talking about moving gigabytes of data between, showing my age here.
But, I wasn't going to say it.
When a gigabyte was like, wow. But when you're talking about needing to migrate data in a well-controlled, a well-governed fashion, that is still a large number. It is still,
and if you have to, I guess I pointed out, because if you have to have an intermediary step where, we're moving this out to like the AWS cloud as an intermediary step between our, legacy platform and our new ServiceNow platform, because we've got to have a SQL database in the middle to run our scripts against or something like that. It can be a significant consideration when you're talking about, that much data. Not only how do we migrate it, and especially because it's got to be, encrypted in transit, but, simply the cost of that amount of storage is still not always insignificant.
That's true. That's true. And yeah, I mean, they're again talking about security and the need to maintain that end-to-end integrity of the data. And that's why I think it's why I want to talk, why I wanted to bring automation into the discussion around security, because, let's say about automation, right? It makes everything, does everything consistently and faster. And consistency is key when maintaining the integrity of your data, right? You want it migrated exactly the same every single time. All the data comes across the same way. And knowing that you're not getting those, attacker in the middle kind of situations because you thought that through. But then saying, okay, yeah, but we're not going to have a person do this because people aren't good at that sort of thing. People are not good at manually moving things from one place to another consistently. So creating an automation platform, or not, actually in our case, it is basically an entire platform to migrate that data efficiently and in an automated fashion, only serves to improve the integrity and make and confidentiality of that data as it moves from one platform to another.
Absolutely. So we're at about 15 minutes left. I seems like we've got some questions stacking up here. So let's move on and take some questions here.
Excellent. Everybody feel free to use the Q&A panel if you've got any questions for Mark and Brian to tackle. I've got a handful here, and I'm trying to group them, the similar ones together. So let me start moving back to the retention conversation. So a couple questions here. Say you don't necessarily need the data for retention purposes, but you need it for reporting and metrics. How do you have the conversation with the data owners or even the executive team to determine or limit the data to bring over? And related to that, if you need it for compliance or some other retention reason, but the data is bad, how do you approach the conversation of fixing the bad data So you're not doing a quote lift and shift of trash. So kind of similar.
Yeah, so
Go for
okay,
it.
so there's kind of two, Mark, I'm gonna let you take the lift and shift the bad data question, but I'll before that, take the measurement question. And I'm sorry, Lindsay, can you repeat the first one again for me, just so I make sure
Yeah,
I've got exactly the right answer here?
absolutely. Say you don't necessarily need the data for retention purposes, but need it for reporting or metrics. How do you have the conversation with the data owners or even the executive team to determine or limit the data to bring over?
Yep. Okay. So this gets into, kind of a related idea. Those of you who took ITIL 3 Foundations might remember from the continual service improvement module, there's this element of looking at measurements and specifically, why we measure things. Because as an organization or as a profession, we kind of have this tendency sometimes to just measure things just because we can. And also to continue to measure things long after they cease to be useful, right? So, it's entirely possible that, we put together this report every Friday at 4 o'clock that takes us 2 hours to do. And, that goes out to 15 people. And, every single person is going up, yep, there it is, but they don't actually do anything with it anymore, right? So the guidance there is, that if we're measuring something, it should be used either to validate, direct, justify, or intervene, right? To validate our assumptions, to direct our investments or actions, to intervene or course correct, or to ultimately just to be making decisions, right? So the first thing in having those conversations with the data owner or with the business leadership is, what are we using this for? What decisions are you looking to make on this? And that will ultimately drive what we do with this data. And in terms of, bringing it across, that will ultimately tell us whether it's okay for us to put this in an archive location. Maybe we can throw it into its own data lake or SQL database someplace else, and we can run, Power BI queries on it, and or Tableau reports or Crystal or whatever we need to do to get those reports on that historical data every so often. But I guess it wouldn't be every so often, it's static. But then we'll use the built-in performance analytics and ServiceNow on the new things, and we can just say, okay, yes, we've got this baseline data, we've got these baseline metrics that we got from our legacy data, but what we're running the business on day to day is the performance analytics we're getting out of ServiceNow off of the new ongoing, constantly refreshing live data. So hopefully that answered your question. And then Mark, if you want to tackle the what do we do when our data is garbage?
When we have garbage data, that's it's not an uncommon thing. I think that happens frequently, and sometimes is the catalyst for moving from one platform to another is that the data has become garbage. If it is compliance, regulatory compliance or contractual compliance data, that we have to keep, that must be retained. Again, this is one of those places where I would say that, if you can maintain just a separate data lake of that, to keep it out of the way, that is 100% the way I would go every time. And we used to, again, showing my age here, but when most folks were using on-premise solutions, not cloud solutions, and had control of the databases, most of the time when somebody was migrating from one platform to another, we would say, look, you can shut down the platform and just keep the database, and then we can just reference the database from the tool directly and say, hey, this data is over there, and you can still reference it. We might have built a relationship. If it was IT data, service desk data, we might build a relationship to the user that reported or submitted the request, or the change owner in the new system. Build that sort of external relationship, so we could look at that user and go, oh, okay, here's all the changes they had in the legacy system. I mean, that would be if the data is really not clean. And
yeah, I was going to say it kind of ends up being the same answer, doesn't it? Right? That like
yeah,
that, especially if it's garbage data, you want to put it someplace else, and we just have to say, look, we've got a line in the sand. We've got some metrics and some reports that are on legacy data, and we don't necessarily trust those all that much because we know the data wasn't great. But it's the baseline we have. And then, going forward, we're going to run our business and department and team based on the live data that we're pulling out of performance analytics and ServiceNow.
right. Yeah, I think and that is the line in the sand to me, which is everything, everything in the new platform, everything going forward is the stuff we're actually working with.
Yeah.
Right? That's what we work
Yeah.
on. That's the data that we need today, tomorrow, next week. The data from the old system, while possibly very valuable, is not being worked with. It may be getting
Right.
referenced.
It's not live. It's not, it's static.
Yeah, and that's the question. And you're going back to the idea of moving open records, things that are being actively worked, and that being a big lift. But most of that data is going to be archival, read only. We're never going back and changing who approved a change in 2021. It's just never happening.
So we looks like we have another question on project management of some sort. Lindsay, you want to?
Yeah, again, we've got a couple. I'll try to more elegantly combine them this time. Around the kind of how do you approach this? And Mark, this reminds me of a conversation that you and I had as we were initially prepping for this session. A lot of times people leave this chunk of the project to the very end thinking like, oh, we'll just like toss it over there. That's not going to work, as I think we've learned. So a couple questions around that. When do you start doing this? Should this be treated as a formal project outside of the implementation? And who should be involved in making these decisions?
Yeah,
well,
yeah, go ahead, Mark.
I was going to say, I'd start now. The best time to start was yesterday. The next best time to start is right now. This should be one of the first, absolutely one of the first considerations and plans you make if you're going to migrate, if you're looking to migrate data platforms at all. You're absolutely right. We did have this conversation, Lindsay, about, people think of, oh, it's just data, we'll just move it. And then, we're 2 weeks from release and it's like, what about all this data? And we realize it's a 3-month project to get the data moved. So yeah, I mean, getting in early on this planning of your data migration, understanding again what data needs to be moved, all the questions that we've kind of covered in this webinar, and probably more for your specific organization. Get those questions answered before you really start any formal design even of the new platform. Because they can also inform some of those design decisions as well. At the end, data is what we want. The information and knowledge that these platforms provide us with. So understanding what data you have and how that data is accessed and secured and moved can help drive some design decisions as to how the platform is actually developed.
Yeah, I was going to say, the other side of that though is I think we have to develop some of the questions that we talked about right at the beginning. What do you need? What do you need it for? When do you really need it for? And what are your legal and contractual obligations? That helps you get to what the minimum viable migration is, right? And I think you do have to establish that, because there is the other risk that this can be a deep well where the organization can just get stuck in a analysis paralysis, and you don't end up being able to get off of your legacy platform. Everybody gets nervous about data, and that's how people that's how you ended up renewing the last time that you didn't want to, right? That's how people end up on a platform that is not suitable to business needs for 5, 6, 7 years before they finally get migrated. So it's important to come up with, to attack it early, but come up with what your minimum viable approach is, so that you can, so that you don't just get stuck.
I think that's actually really great advice. Pragmatism in data migration is probably the key.
Perfect is the enemy of the good here, or perfect is the
Always.
enemy of done, right? For sure.
And in a lot of cases, it's the enemy of even getting started.
Right.
It is important that I think, and I think that kind of leads to maybe, and I don't know if we agree on this, Brian. I don't think we've actually ever talked about it specifically, but should this portion be run as a separate project, under separate, and I don't know. I mean, I think that depends heavily on volume, on complexity, on your appetite for taking on a large scale portion of the project altogether.
Yeah, I think that comes down to, like, I think right away you give accountability to somebody, establish that minimum viable approach, and then depending what that minimum viable approach is, you'll apply that to your organization's standards for what requires a project, right? Does it,
right. Yeah.
but yeah, I don't know if there's a cookie cutter answer to that. We got 3 minutes. Let's try to get one more question in before we run out of time.
I have 2 more. Quickly though, I don't think you guys addressed, not to call you out, who would own this? Who owns this? Is this part of, I'll just stop there. Who owns it? Tell me.
It's Mark.
It's Mark.
That's about right.
Always Mark.
I think that if you have, first off, I would say if your organization has a governance arm, a formal GRC group, or they're likely the ones that would manage this and own it, because it is a governance question. If you go ahead.
Before that, though, that minimum viable approach, right? I think that you ultimately, whoever owns the project to implement ServiceNow, right? That you're going to have somebody at the organization who is the project owner or the product owner, or something along those lines. This is an intrinsic part of that project, so this becomes owned there, and then it is up to that person to delegate that as they see fit, as a key element of the project, as one of those critical path items that has to be settled before we go live.
Awesome. So quickly, I want to say you'll be getting an email from me, everyone, today with a recording of this session. And we've got a white paper that covers all this stuff. So I'll send that along as well. So you can have something in writing.
And that's on the website, right?
It is. Yep. You can go to our resources page and you can find that there. I'll send you some helpful stuff. But just for fun, for those who maybe don't have a hard stop, the last question was, is there any kind of standard for how far back you go in retaining this data? I know you mentioned 6 months, et cetera. Is it truly organization by organization, or are there any standards or like a checklist from which you can work when you're going through this process?
Yeah, I mean, it is organization by organization, but that said, my experience is that the most people fall on either the 2 weeks to 30 days range on incident data. Obviously when we're talking about knowledge articles, those will go back as far as they're useful. We're probably not going to bring across any articles on Windows 98, but anything that's actually still useful, we want to bring across regardless of how old it is. And then the changes, that tends to be governed by whatever the regulatory requirement is. Most people are bringing changes because of a regulatory, a Sarbanes-Oxley or an ISO requirement or whatever.
Awesome. Well, we're at the hour. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Brian. And thank you to everybody who joined us today. I hope the rest of your Wednesday is lovely.